What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an early preview of Clair Obscur Expedition 33 after playing it for several hours via a non-public demo that was made available to me. More on that in just a moment. So, like many people, when this game was first announced, I was very interested in the art style and just the general look of it and everything, and I've been following along since then, as it has an upcoming release date of April. And I'm happy to say, after having played it for a few hours, that it is, in fact, what I was expecting. A sort of JRPG-styled game with a very unique setting alongside a few interesting mechanics to boot. With that exact thing in mind, I think the combat of this one is going to be real make or break for people. It does have a difficulty setting that allows you to adjust this, but much of it hinges on parrying and dodging and even jumping actively out of the way of enemy attacks that come in, despite the game being in turn-based. So I've seen other sort of turn-based games and even JRPGs use a mechanic like that before, but it is a very big emphasis here. Now, on Expedition, the sort of medium difficulty, it says that this is optional, but I would say, having played through this demo on that difficulty, you're going to struggle if you don't kind of get in line with that one. And while you could throw it on story, I imagine that won't be satisfying for people, and that's why I'm saying I think the combat will make or break this for any individual person, which brings me back to the demo. As of right now, this demo is not available publicly. It is my hope that they make it available publicly before the game actually releases, so people can interact with this combat system for themselves, which I think is going to wind up being probably one of the main determinations people make when they're looking to buy it. But with all of that said, let's move on and start talking about the game properly. So, Expedition 33 takes place in a world where a paintress once a year paints a number descending on a rock. So it was 34, and this year it's 33, and everybody that age and above dies, kind of just disappears into the nothing. The sort of main character here, Gustav, his significant other recently died, and so every year they put together an expedition of people who aren't, going to last if they don't go on the expedition anyway, to try to stop the paintress from doing this and seemingly killing all these people, though as I said, they seem to just sort of fade away. Unsurprisingly, then, that expedition does not go particularly well, and we soon find ourselves stranded with very little hope, only to meet up with a couple of other survivors as we continue on our mission to try to do something about the paintress, and along the way we're obviously going to have a very surrealist adventure, fighting off all sorts of enemies, really. Ultimately, though, it looks like our main team is going to be Gustav, Lune, and Mayel. I know there's one more character from the trailers as well, but it wasn't really available to play here. Now, each of these individual characters has a different sort of play style, as is pretty usual. For instance, Gustav will make abilities that charge up his arm, which is mechanical, and then he can unleash that via an overcharge ability that deals a nonsense amount of lightning damage the more you charge it up. Whereas Lune is able to put sort of elemental marks on the enemy, it calls them elemental stains, and then her other abilities will consume those stains to deal extra effects, whereas Mayel switches stance as she uses her abilities, and each stance does something different, and you kind of have to keep it moving in order to maximize her effectiveness. So even within that team, there's a lot of sort of different ways to approach handling each individual character, which is then augmented, of course, by the actual progression systems. We will be equipping weapons and what the game calls pictos. Pictos are effectively equipable abilities, but the catch is, as you have these abilities equipped, once you've beaten a few battles with them equipped, you can learn their effects on a more permanent basis, and this is party-wide. Everyone you learn this way applies to the entire party. But in order to actually activate those permanently learned ones, you either have to keep that picto equipped or activate it via its Lumina, which is all of the abilities that you've learned via pictos. Each character has a set sort of amount of points that they can learn Lumina with, meaning that you'll have a bunch of passive abilities from the pictos equipped, plus the actual pictos themselves. And that seems to make up the bulk of your progression, and it'll be all sorts of passive abilities that augments all the things you can do in combat, and switching those out and around is what is going to determine your general combat effectiveness. On top of stuff like leveling up, of course. Now, every time a character levels up, they also get attribute and skill points. You'll get 3 attribute points to distribute however you want. Weapons do scale off of different attributes, and weapons themselves have elements attached to them, which is certainly something to know. And then as you level up, you also get skill points to unlock more skills to use in combat. That one's pretty straightforward. But from there, let's start talking exploration. So we got a whole bunch of individual areas connected via a world map. In this demo, we saw the sort of opening area, the spring meadows, and then the flying waters, this sort of surrealist underwater place that isn't actually underwater, which was really weird. And there's a fair bit of exploration to be had there. You can find all sorts of currency as well as items to upgrade the various items you can actually use in combat per rest. So there are sort of checkpoints, expedition flags from the previous expeditions where you can stop and rest. Resting will sort of reinstate all of the enemies you've run into already via the game's turn-based battles. You can clear them out, but then if you go rest, they'll come back, which is going to allow you to grind. But this is also where you'll go to do things like learn abilities and upgrade your attributes. However, each time you stop at a rest stop, you also reset your chroma elixirs as well as your various tints, it calls them, which are basically potions. These are items you can use in combat except for the chroma elixirs, which are like a full heal outside of combat, just so you can keep going in between individual stops at a rest point. Whereas the tints are your ability to like revive and heal and stuff during combat. They effectively act as your restorative items. So most of exploration, of course, involves fighting all these guys as well as finding all those different items, but you can also find lore about the previous expeditions, the ones who have all failed or died. Now, out on the world map, you'll be able to make camp, which is where you'll be able to talk to companions as well as rest. There are some items that allude to a weapon upgrade system that I did not see in this demo, so that's something to know. And on the world map, there were even some interactable objects that created like shortcuts via the terrain and stuff, so I'm curious to see how widespread that particular mechanic would be. And then they've already shown via like trailers and stuff that you'll be able to swim via the interesting creations that you'll befriend along the way. So there's that. But I mentioned combat a little bit already, but let's talk about it a little more specifically. So turn-based system with those active elements I mentioned earlier. Now on your turn you can attack, which will generate action points. You can also free aim, which involves freely shooting a ranged attack. Now that's important to hit enemy weak spots, which can deal massive damage, but also it's pretty much the best way to deal with flying enemies. Some enemies are considered flying and they rarely get hit by your basic attacks or abilities, and thus shooting them this way is the way to go. But free aim costs action points, 1 per shot as you might expect, so even then there's a more active element to the combat itself, which I thought was interesting. And then there's all those individual elements to each character you're controlling that I mentioned earlier, but when it's the enemy's turn, they will often attack or cast a spell, and you're going to, ideally, dodge or parry away. Later on, they introduce a jump mechanic, which is honestly probably the easiest one, but when an enemy attacks you, you can dodge or parry. If they are physically attacking you, parry is really the way to go, because then you can counterattack afterwards, which tends to be pretty devastating while also giving you action points. When it comes to things like spells, dodging seems to be the way to go, but the timing, as you might imagine, can be a little bit tricky, and sometimes it takes multiple prompts. Enemies, of course, have some things to watch out for besides this, namely your standard elemental resistance stuff, but also the occasional armor mechanic. Sometimes enemies will have armor points, which will block 1 hit per armor, which means ideally you want to use multiple hits from a low-level ability to clear out the armor so your big hits don't get completely nullified by armor mechanics. And all of that, of course, on top of the more traditional sort of interesting boss mechanics. A few bosses that are just present in this demo have their own mechanics, including one of them that grows flowers and then absorbs them for interesting powers, which is how they concluded this particular demo. Now, putting all of that together, I really enjoyed the combat, surprisingly. I think it has a lot of interesting elements, especially things like the free aim and finding weak points on enemies, while also managing your action points and actively engaging with the enemy. And it makes kind of every combat encounter pretty impactful, but also a little more specific to the area you're in. They don't feel very random in the sense that JRPGs tend to have just a lot of battles. Pretty much every fight here seems to be very well thought out, even if they are able to be grinded with some of the smaller enemies, mind you. There's just a very active element here that keeps you engaged, and I'm curious to see how that would play out over the course of the entire title, which is probably the thing I'm interested in finding out the most for myself. But here in this preview, at least, I enjoyed it quite a bit, especially because you can definitely still kind of level up and power up to the point where low-level enemies are just taken out immediately, so you don't have to like suffer through tons of innocuous little fights if you don't want to. But I'm very interested in seeing how that whole thing plays out. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, I had a very good time with this demo. I hope they make it available for the public so they can make a decision for themselves as well. So while I was already looking forward to this game, I'm definitely even more interested in it now, which is where I think I'm going to wrap up this particular video. So with all of that said, I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, especially if you're looking forward to the review in April, of course. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.